The afternoon sun beat down upon the bustling city square as officers from the central precinct surrounded the quaint flower shop. It was an odd scene, a full task force of law enforcement, complete with flashing lights and barking orders, all for a single woman. Inside the shop, Clara Bennett stood behind the counter, her apron speckled with bits of soil and flower petals, her serene face betraying no sign of fear. "Clara Bennett!" bellowed Officer Harrison, a burly man with a penchant for dramatic entrances. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Come out with your hands up." The small crowd of onlookers that had gathered outside exchanged murmurs of disbelief. Clara, the sweet, soft-spoken florist who had lived in the neighborhood for years, seemed an unlikely suspect for such serious crimes. Clara's soft voice echoed through the open doorway. "Embezzlement, you say? New one. What happened to tax evasion?" Officer Harrison's face flushed beet red. "Enough of the humor. Step outside now." Clara sighed and wiped her hands on her apron. Deliberately slow, she made her way toward the door frame, nonchalantly lounging there as though about to step out to have a cup of tea, instead of confronting this mob of officers. She looked about at the view with large, wide eyes before settling them on Harrison. "Good afternoon, officer," she sweetly offered. "Would you care for some chrysanthemums? They're fresh from the market." "Save it!" Harrison snarled, stepping forward to cuff her. Clara proffered her wrists without resistance, the faintest smile playing on her lips. The ride to the precinct was anything but quiet. Harrison, seated beside her in the back of the squad car, couldn't help but gloat. "You thought you could hide forever, didn't you?" he sneered. "Well, newsflash, sweetheart, the law always catches up." Clara leaned her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Is that what you think this is? The law catching up?" Harrison frowned. "What else would it be?" She chuckled low in her throat, the sound more amused than defiant. "Oh, nothing. Please continue." At the precinct, Clara was led to an interrogation room. The walls were unadorned, and the single overhead light beat down relentlessly, casting the entire room in stark shadows. A few minutes later, Harrison and his partner, Detective Linda Parks, entered. Parks was a sharp-eyed woman who liked to let her partner's bluster distract while she observed. "Let's cut to the chase," Harrison said, slapping a file onto the table. "We have evidence linking you to offshore accounts, falsified documents, and insider trading schemes. So why don't you save us all some time and confess?" Clara leaned forward, resting her chin on her clasped hands. "Offshore accounts? I can barely keep track of my checking account. And insider trading? The most inside I get is deciding whether to use mulch or fertilizer for my roses." Harrison's jaw clenched. "This isn't a joke, Bennett." "Oh, I know," Clara said, her voice suddenly serious. "It's a misunderstanding. One I'm sure we can clear up quickly if you just let me make one phone call." Parks, who had been silent until now, raised an eyebrow. "Who would you call? Your lawyer?" Clara's eyes sparkled with mischief. "No. My husband." The officers exchanged a glance. "Fine," Harrison said after a moment. "One call. But don't think you're getting out of this." They escorted her to a phone. Clara dialed a number from memory, her fingers steady. After 2 rings, a deep, calm voice answered. "Hello, darling," Clara said, her voice warm. "I'm afraid I've found myself in a bit of a situation." Parks and Harrison leaned in, trying to catch the conversation. They could only hear Clara's side, but the tone of the call made their stomachs tighten. "Yes, at the Central Precinct," Clara continued. "Could you come by? And please bring the documents." She paused, listening. "Oh, no rush. I'm sure they're enjoying my company." She hung up and turned to the officers with a smile. "He'll be here shortly." 30 minutes later, the precinct lobby doors swung open. A tall man in a tailored suit strode in, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. His dark eyes scanned the space before landing on the desk sergeant. "I'm here for my wife," he said, his voice low and steady. The sergeant blinked, clearly flustered. "And you are?" The man reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal a badge. The gold lettering shimmered under the fluorescent lights. Special Agent Jonathan Bennett, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The sergeant's face turned pale. Oh, right this way, Agent Bennett. Back in the interrogation room, Harrison and Parks were shocked when the door burst open and Jonathan Bennett strode in. He was clad in a sharp suit, cold as ice, but what happened next was absolute chaos. Mr. Bennett? Harrison started, confusion threading his tone. Agent Bennett, Jonathan corrected, his gaze darting immediately to Clara. Are you all right? Clara nodded. Oh, I'm fine. They've been very accommodating. Jonathan's gaze snapped back to Harrison and Parks, his voice cold. On what grounds was my wife arrested? Harrison fumbled over his words. We have evidence linking her to Jonathan held up a hand, silencing him. Let me stop you there. Whatever evidence you think you have, it's fabricated. My team has been monitoring this operation for months. You've been played. Parks' eyes narrowed. Played by whom? Jonathan pulled a folder from his briefcase and laid it on the table. By the very people you should be investigating. Clara is innocent. In fact, she's been assisting the FBI with gathering intel on a major criminal network. Your evidence is nothing more than a diversion. Harrison's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. Parks flipped through the folder, her face growing more serious with each page. This changes everything, she whispered. Jonathan nodded curtly. Yes, it does. And unless you want a formal complaint filed against this precinct, I suggest you release her immediately. 10 minutes later, Clara and Jonathan walked out of the precinct together. She slipped her arm through his, her serene smile firmly in place. You always make such an entrance, she teased. Jonathan smirked. And you always know how to keep your cool. Behind them, Harrison and Parks watched from the doorway, their expressions a mix of frustration and disbelief. Harrison muttered, I had no idea who we were dealing with. Parks shrugged. Next time, do your homework. As the Bennetts vanished into city streets, one thing became crystal clear. No one ever underestimated Clara Bennett again. The precinct buzzed long after Clara and Jonathan Bennett had walked out. Detective Linda Parks sat at her desk, flipping through the folder Jonathan had left behind. Every page was a revelation: bank transactions, communications logs, and surveillance photos that painted a damning picture of corruption and conspiracy. It was a house of cards, and Clara Bennett had been the catalyst. We really screwed up, didn't we? Officer Harrison muttered, leaning against the desk. Parks didn't look up. That's putting it mildly. We let ourselves be played, Harrison. And now we're sitting on a powder keg. Harrison's face went red. Who even is this guy? Jonathan Bennett swoops in here, throws around some fancy badge, and suddenly we're the bad guys? He's not just some guy, Parks snapped. He's FBI. And if half of what's in this folder is true, we've been targeting the wrong people for months. Meanwhile, Clara and Jonathan were driving through the city in his unassuming black sedan. Clara gazed out the window, her serene expression giving nothing away. But Jonathan could sense the tension beneath her calm exterior. You okay? He asked, his voice soft. She turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. I'm fine. Just thinking about how much trouble we stirred up back there. Jonathan smirked. They'll be fine. Parks seemed sharp enough. She'll figure it out. And Harrison? Clara asked, raising an eyebrow. Jonathan chuckled. Harrison's ego took a hit. But maybe that's what he needed. Clara leaned back in her seat, a reflective look crossing her face. Do you think they'll find the real culprits? Jonathan's grip on the wheel tightened. They'll have to. Because if they don't, we will. Back at the precinct, Parks and Harrison were treated to the arrival of Captain Willis. A no-nonsense man with a graying beard and a perpetual scowl, Willis strode into the room, his eyes narrowing as he took in the tense atmosphere. What's going on? He demanded. Parks stood, holding up the folder. Captain, you need to see this. It's about Clara Bennett. Willis took the folder, scanning its contents. His frown deepened with each passing page. Where is this from? Her husband, Parks said. Special Agent Jonathan Bennett, FBI. He claims we've been fed false evidence to cover up a larger operation. Willis snapped the folder shut. And you believe him? I do, Parks said firmly. The details check out. If we keep pursuing Clara, we're not just wasting time, we're protecting the real criminals. Willis' jaw tightened. Then we need to act fast. Start vetting this evidence, and see where it leads. And Harrison? Harrison straightened. Yes, Captain? Try not to arrest any more innocent florists, Willis said, his tone dry. As the precinct scrambled to turn their investigation around, Clara and Jonathan arrived at the secure location, an unmarked building in the heart of the city. Inside, a small team of agents worked within a high-tech operations center. Screens showed live feeds of data streams and maps marked with red pins. Agent Bennett, a young analyst, greeted them. We have been monitoring the precinct. It would appear they are finally changing direction. Good, Jonathan said. What about our primary target? The analyst gestured toward one of the screens. We traced the financial activity to a shell company based offshore. It's a front for the Crimson Syndicate. Clara's face hardened. The same group that framed me. Exactly, the analyst confirmed. They've been using small businesses like yours to launder money and hide their tracks. When you refused to cooperate, they decided to make an example of you. Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder. They underestimated you. And now they're going to pay for it. Meanwhile, as the FBI team was putting the finishing touches on their plan, Parks and Harrison followed a new line of evidence to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, they found crates of forged documents, counterfeit currency, and a ledger matching the accounts Jonathan had flagged. This is it, Parks said, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. This ties everything together. Harrison nodded, though his face had turned grim. But it also means we're in over our heads. We need backup. They'll call it in, Parks said, pulling out her radio. And let's hope we're not too late. With night falling, the stage was all set for confrontation. Clara and Jonathan joined the preparations by the FBI team to raid the headquarters of the Crimson Syndicate. In the room, the tension was high as Jonathan outlined the plan. Our objective is to seize the financial records and apprehend their leaders, he said. But be prepared, these people won't go down without a fight. Clara stood in the back of the room, listening intently. As the briefing ended, she approached Jonathan. What can I do? She asked. Jonathan hesitated. Clara, you've already done enough. This could get dangerous. And that's exactly why I need to help, she insisted. They tried to destroy my life. I want to see this through. Jonathan studied her a moment, then nodded. Stay close to me. And if things go south, you get out. Promise me that. Clara nodded. I promise. The raid started just before midnight. The headquarters of the syndicate was surrounded by FBI agents, who moved with fluid quickness. Clara kept close to Jonathan as they breached the building, her heart racing with adrenaline. Indoors, bedlam broke loose as members of the syndicate hastily tried to destroy the evidence, but the agents would have none of that. Jonathan led the charge with quiet efficiency, his calmness belying the criminal frenzy on display. In all that confusion, Clara singled out a familiar face, one of the men who had planted her frame. Without an ounce of hesitation, she stepped forth. Remember me? Her voice was steady despite her blazing eyes. The man froze, his face morphing from surprise to fear. I was only following orders. He stuttered. Bad choice, Clara replied, crossing her arms. But fortunately for you, I'm not the one making arrests today. Jonathan appeared beside her, his presence sending the man into a full-blown panic. You have the right to remain silent, Jonathan said coolly, slapping handcuffs onto the man's wrists. And I suggest you use it. By dawn, the operation was over. The Crimson Syndicate leadership was now in custody, their records seized, and operations dismantled. As Clara and Jonathan walked out of the building, the first rays of the sun painted the city in golden hues. "We did it," Clara said softly. Jonathan smiled. "No, you did it. You stood your ground and turned the tables on them." Clara smiled up at him, bright. "Perhaps. But it pays to have a husband who can make an entrance." Jonathan laughed. "And it pays to have a wife who never retreats." One thing became clear as they drove away, the city behind them just beginning to wake up. A force was to be acknowledged in the name of the Bennets. The morning after the raid on the Crimson Syndicate headquarters was a whirlwind of activity. Media outlets splashed the story across headlines. Major criminal syndicate dismantled in overnight operation, and FBI and local authorities strike back against organized crime. But for Clara and Jonathan Bennett, the work was far from over. Clara sat in the small office at the field headquarters of the FBI and scrolled through her phone. Her inbox was flooded with messages of support from her friends and neighbors, though she couldn't shake this nagging thought that it wasn't over yet. Across the room, Jonathan stood with a group of agents discussing what was next. "We have the physical evidence secured," one of the agents said, tapping a tablet. "But the syndicate's financial network is still operational. If we don't shut it down soon, they'll regroup and rebuild." Jonathan nodded. "What's the status on tracing their offshore accounts?" "Still working on it," the agent replied. "It's a labyrinth of shell companies and false identities." Clara set her phone down and crossed the room. "What if you're looking at it the wrong way?" she said, drawing their attention. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Clara gestured toward the tablet. "The syndicate isn't just a criminal network, it's a business. Businesses need patterns to operate: regular shipments, recurring payments. Instead of following the money, follow the habits. Find the cracks in their routine." The agent exchanged a look with Jonathan, impressed. "She's not wrong. That might give us a lead." Jonathan's lips twitched into a smile. "You've been spending too much time around me." Clara grinned. "Someone has to keep you sharp." Later that day, the team's efforts began to pay off. Clara's suggestion led them to an overlooked shipping route connected with a front company the syndicate used in smuggling contraband goods. The shipments would arrive at a port warehouse that evening. "This is it," Jonathan said as the team prepared for yet another operation. "If we intercept these shipments, we have all we need to disrupt their financial network." Clara, standing nearby, folded her arms. "What's the plan?" "Standard raid," Jonathan replied. "We'll have agents on the ground and surveillance teams monitoring the area. It should be straightforward." Clara frowned. "Should be?" Jonathan hesitated. "The syndicate knows we're onto them. They'll be desperate, which makes them dangerous." Clara's jaw tightened. "Then we'll just have to be more careful." That evening, the FBI team assembled near the port, their vehicles discreetly parked out of sight. The air was thick with tension as agents checked their equipment and reviewed their positions. Clara stayed close to Jonathan, her sharp eyes scanning the area. The warehouse loomed ahead, its dark silhouette lit only by a few flickering floodlights. A convoy of trucks was parked outside, their engines idling. Men in unmarked uniforms moved crates from the trucks into the building. Jonathan spoke into his radio. "All teams, hold positions. Wait for my signal." Clara tugged at his sleeve. "Something feels off." He glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She nodded toward the warehouse. "Look at the guards. They're not just workers. They're armed, and they're too organized for a simple smuggling operation." Jonathan's expression darkened as he studied the scene. "You're right. This isn't just a shipment. They're preparing for something bigger." He spoke into his radio again. "Change of plans. Team Bravo, flank the east side. Team Delta, cover the exits. We're moving in now." It was a raid done with preciseness. Agents stormed the warehouse, their movements swift and synchronized. Clara stayed close to Jonathan, her heart racing with every echoing shot through the building. The syndicate's men fought back, but they could not hold up against the FBI training and the greater number. As the chaos died down, Clara and Jonathan proceeded further into the warehouse. They came across a secret office with documents and computer equipment. Jonathan started going through the files, while Clara examined a big map pinned to the wall. "This isn't just about smuggling," she said, tracing the lines on the map. "They're coordinating operations across multiple cities." Jonathan nodded grimly. "And they're doing it quick. If we don't shut this down full, they'll bounce back hard." As the team secured the warehouse, there was an unexpected sound that made Clara's blood run cold, a faint beeping, originating from a crate at the corner. "Jonathan," she called out urgently, "something is wrong." He joined her, his eyes narrowing as he examined the crate. Carefully, he pried it open to reveal a small device with a blinking red light. "A bomb," he muttered. "They were going to destroy the evidence." Clara's heart raced. "Can you disarm it?" Jonathan examined the device. His hands were steady. "You'll need a minute. Stay back." She nodded and stepped away, her eyes not leaving his face. Around them, the remaining agents worked to clear the building, unaware of the immediate danger. Minutes felt like hours as Jonathan worked, his focus unshakable. Finally, with a soft click, the device powered down. "Got it," he said, letting out a deep breath. Clara hurried to his side, relief washing over her. "You scared me there for a second." He gave her a small smile. Just another day at the office. By the end of the night, the warehouse was secure, and the operation of the syndicate had been dismantled. Clara and Jonathan were standing outside while evidence was being loaded into FBI vehicles. "We took down their network," he said. "It is a huge victory." Clara nodded, but her face didn't change to one of less contemplation. "But they will try again, won't they?" Jonathan put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Not if we keep fighting together." Clara looked at him, resolution shining bright in her eyes. "Then let's make sure they don't get the chance." As they moved away from the scene and the first light of dawn broke in the horizon, one thing became certain: the Bennetts never fought just for justice, but an unstoppable one. The morning after the warehouse raid sat Clara and Jonathan in FBI field headquarters reviewing recent events. The Crimson Syndicate was badly hurt, but none of its leaders behind bars yet. Clara sipped coffee as she scanned the reports in front of her on the desk. "The operation was a success," Jonathan said, breaking the silence. "But we're not done yet. We need to track down their leadership." Clara nodded. "And we need to act fast. They're going to retaliate." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You've been through a lot in the past few days. Are you sure you're up for this?" She looked right at him, determination in her stare. "I'm not stopping until we finish what we started." The syndicate wasn't going to go down without a fight. That afternoon, the call was anonymous. It led the FBI to an abandoned hotel on the outskirts of the city, a known syndicate meeting spot. Jonathan and Clara joined a team of agents preparing to investigate the venue. The hotel was a relic from times past, with boarded-up windows and graffiti-tagged walls. The air thickened with tension as agents circled the building. Jonathan gave quiet orders. His voice remained steady in the face of danger. "Team Alpha, take the front. Team Bravo, back exit. Clara, stick close." Clara nodded, her heart racing as they approached the building. The creak of the door echoed through the lobby as they entered. Inside, the air was stale, and the faint murmur of voices could be heard from an upper floor. Jonathan nodded to the rest, and they began to progress slowly up the stairs with guns drawn. They gained the second floor, where the voices were now louder. Clara strained to hear the conversation, shipments and payments. Jonathan nodded at the team for them to fan out. He and Clara moved to a room at the end of the hall from which he heard voices. Jonathan kicked open the door, and bedlam erupted. Inside the room were several scrambling syndicate members grabbing for weapons. Jonathan and the agents moved quickly, ordering and securing suspects in place. Clara stayed near the door, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. In the corner, a man in a suit stood calmly, his hands raised in surrender. He was older, with graying hair and a calculating gaze. Clara recognized him instantly from the photos in the FBI's files. "That's him," she whispered to Jonathan. Vincent Marconi. One of their top leaders. Jonathan nodded, his expression grim. Stay here. He faced Marconi, his tone icy. Vincent Marconi. You are under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and multiple counts of fraud. Marconi smirked. You think you've won, Agent Bennett? You've only scratched the surface. The syndicate is bigger than you can imagine. Jonathan's jaw clenched. We'll see about that. As the agents handcuffed the suspects, Clara observed a laptop on the table, the screen on, with some live feed from elsewhere. She moved closer, and she felt her stomach falling at the view. It was some shipping yard with several stacks of containers and about 3 armed men. Jonathan, she called out to him, pointing at the screen. They have got big plans. Look! Jonathan joined her, his eyes narrowing. That's the Westport yard. They must have another operation running. Clara's mind went racing. We have to stop them before they manage to move whatever is in those containers. Jonathan nodded and spoke into his radio. All units, get ready to regroup and prepare to move out. We've got a new target. The Westport yard was a sprawling complex, full of stacks and stacks of shipping containers towering upwards. The sun had just begun to set, casting a long shadow across the yard, when the FBI arrived. Clara stuck close to Jonathan's side as the agents spread out, positioning themselves for the raid. The atmosphere was tense as they approached the containers. The men of the syndicate were well armed and organized. Their movements suggested they were preparing for a major shipment. Jonathan gave the signal, and the agents moved in. Suddenly, there was gunfire as the agents took on the syndicate. Clara dropped behind a container, her heart racing with the bedlam she beheld. Then she saw Jonathan close by, an island of calm efficiency amidst the firestorm. Above the shooting, Clara detected a movement whereby some men were attempting to get a big crate onto a truck. They're trying to get away with something. She shouted at Jonathan and directed him with a pointed hand. Jonathan nodded, beckoning some agents to surround them. Clara followed, her resolution overriding her fear. The agents closed in, and the men of the syndicate fled, abandoning the crate. Jonathan and Clara approached it warily, prying the crate open to reveal a cache of weapons and counterfeit currency. This is what they were protecting, Jonathan said grimly. This shipment alone could have funded their operations for months. Clara's eyes narrowed. Not anymore. By the end of the night, the syndicate operation at the shipping yard had been dismantled. The FBI had seized the weapons and arrested dozens of members. Clara and Jonathan stood by the vehicles, watching the suspects being loaded into transport vans. A sense of relief washed over them. We have dealt them a major blow, Jonathan said. This will cripple their operations. Clara nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. But it's not just about stopping them. It's about making sure people like this don't get the chance to rise again. Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. And that's exactly what we're doing. Together. Clara looked up at him, her resolve shining in her eyes. Then let's keep fighting. And as they exited the shipping yard, with city lights glowing in the distance, one thing became very clear. The Bennetts weren't just life partners, but also justice partners, and they were going nowhere anytime soon.